Imagine the silence, a silence that is not peace but dread. Imagine the air becoming heavy, dense, stealing the breath from your lungs. You are in a small underground room, dark as a wolf's mouth, with only the flickering flame of an oil lamp for company. Beside you, a jug of water, a loaf of bread and a small bowl of milk. These are not gifts. They are a cruel irony. A supply for a life about to be extinguished in the slowest and most agonizing way the human mind could conceive. Above you, the sound of earth and stones being piled up, each shovelful a nail in your coffin. You were not strangled nor stabbed. Your blood, considered too sacred to be spilled, remains in your veins, and yet you are being executed. You are being buried alive. This was not the fate of an ordinary criminal, but the punishment reserved for those who were once the most revered women of Rome, the guardians of the empire's soul, the Vestal Virgins. And their crime? Daring to love. Today, in Obscure Chronicles, we will descend into this forgotten grave of history and discover the terrifying fate of the priestesses who dared to break their sacred vow. To understand the depth of this horror, we must first understand the light they protected. In the heart of Rome, in the Roman Forum, stood the Temple of Vesta. It was not a temple like the others, filled with monumental statues of gods. Inside, there was no image of the goddess Vesta. There was something far more important, a flame, a sacred flame that could never, ever be extinguished. This fire was considered the beating heart of the empire, the pillar of its existence. It was believed that as long as the flame burned, Rome would be invincible, eternal. If it were extinguished, the city would fall, consumed by chaos and misfortune. And the responsibility of keeping this flame burning day and night for centuries fell on the shoulders of a select group of 6 priestesses, the Vestal Virgins. They were no ordinary women. They were chosen in childhood between the ages of 6 and 10, daughters of the noblest patrician families. The selection was a solemn event, conducted by the name of person who conducted the selection himself, Supreme Pontiff, the High Priest of Rome. The chosen girl was taken from her family in a ceremony that was, in equal parts, an honor and a kidnapping. Her hair was cut, a symbol of her transition and renunciation of the secular world. She exchanged her child's clothes for white linen robes, the color of purity, and was taken to the Vesta's court. She would enter the house of the Vestals, a luxurious palace adjacent to the temple. There she would begin a 30-year service. The first 10 years would be as a novice, learning the complex rituals and sacred duties. The next 10 years would be of active service, the peak of her power, directly tending to the flame and sacred objects of the temple, and the last 10 years would be dedicated to teaching the new generation. During those 30 years, the Vestal Virgins enjoyed privileges that no other woman in Rome, not even the emperor's wife, could dream of. They were legally independent, could own property, write their own wills, and testify in court. In the streets, they were preceded by a lictor, a guard who cleared the way, a privilege reserved for the highest magistrates. At games and spectacles, they sat in places of honor. To touch or harm a Vestal Virgin was a capital crime. They were, in essence, sacred, untouchable. But all this power, all this veneration, came at a terrible price, encapsulated in a single absolute vow, chastity. A Vestal Virgin's vow of chastity was not merely a matter of personal morality, it was a matter of state, a pillar of Rome's security. The purity of their bodies was symbolically linked to the purity and stability of the empire. A virgin Vestal Virgin guaranteed the benevolence of the goddess Vesta and, consequently, divine protection over Rome. If a Vestal Virgin broke her vow, committing what was known as crime of incest, the crime of incest, since they were considered daughters of the state, the contamination of their bodies was seen as a direct pollution of the sacred flame and an omen of impending disasters. Military defeats, famines, plagues, any calamity that befell Rome could be attributed to an impure Vestal Virgin. Which leads us to a disturbing question. Do you think these accusations were always justified, or often a convenient political weapon to find a scapegoat for the empire's problems? Leave your theory in the comments, as history suggests that innocence was a rare luxury when panic gripped the city. When an accusation of incest as terror surged, it spread through Rome like wildfire. The accused Vestal Virgin was brought to trial before the College of Pontiffs. The evidence was often circumstantial, based on rumors or testimonies obtained under torture from her slaves. The man accused of being her lover faced a swift and brutal fate. He was flogged to death in a public square. But for the Vestal Virgin, the punishment was a calculated ritual of horror. Her body was sacred. Her blood could not be spilled by human hands. To kill her directly would be sacrilege. So the Romans, masters of law and cruelty, created a legal and theological solution to execute her without, technically, murdering her. The sentence was a spectacle of terror. On the day of the execution, a funereal silence fell over Rome. The condemned Vestal Virgin was dressed in mourning clothes and placed inside a completely closed litter, bound in such a way that her voice could not be heard. She was carried through the city in a procession that imitated a funeral cortege. The crowd watched in terrified silence, for they saw not a woman but the very misfortune of Rome. The procession headed towards a place outside the city walls, a place with a sinister name, the Campus Scelerisque, the Cursed Field. There, a small underground chamber had been prepared. It wasn't a grave, but a small room, furnished with a bed, the aforementioned oil lamp, and a symbolic portion of food and drink. Supreme Pontiff, with his face veiled, he uttered a prayer, absolving himself and Rome of guilt for the priestess's death. The Vestal Virgin was then untied and forced down a ladder to her living tomb. The ladder was removed, and the chamber's entrance was sealed with earth and stone until no trace of her existence remained on the surface. Rome had not killed her. She had not died of hunger, for she had food. She had not died by violence, for her blood had not been spilled. In the eyes of divine law, she would simply cease to exist, abandoned by gods and men in the cold, suffocating embrace of the earth. We can only imagine the final moments, the final echo of the shovel striking the earth, the total darkness when the lamp's oil finally ran out, the air thinning, the panic, the absolute solitude, and the slow, maddening wait for the end. It was a psychological death before it was physical, a torture designed to be as terrible in its conception as in its execution. Historical cases, such as those of the Vestal Oppia and centuries later the principal Vestal Cornelia, condemned by Emperor Domitian, prove that this was not just a myth but a terrifying reality. Cornelia, according to accounts, protested her innocence to the end, and as she was led to the chamber, her robe caught on the steps. When the executioner approached to help her, she recoiled in horror, as if his touch were the final desecration, preserving her purity until her last breath. The flame of Vesta finally went out in 394 AD, when the Christian Emperor Theodosius I banned all pagan cults. The temple was closed and the last Vestal Virgins dismissed. But the echo of their footsteps and the shadow of their terrible fate still haunt the ruins of the Roman Forum. They were women of immense power and privilege, living at the center of the world, but chained to an ideal of purity so absolute that a single mistake, real or imagined, condemned them to be swallowed by the earth. A grim reminder that in history, power and danger are often two sides of the same sacred coin. If you're fascinated by the darker, forgotten side of history, don't forget to subscribe to Dark Chronicles and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next journey into the shadows of the past. What other brutal ancient ritual would you like us to explore? Tell us in the comments. Until next time.